Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and we'll call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. But that verse, obviously, we're familiar with it because we recognize that was a prophecy about Jesus, about the birth of our Savior. But it came in a very specific historical setting. And I want to dive into that. We're going to look at the fuller picture of Isaiah chapter 7 this morning. And so it comes, that verse, of course, comes in with a whole chapter. And the setting of the chapter was war, basically. It's like got a map up on the screen there. I don't know if it's about as big as I can make it. But this map, you can see the purple is the kingdom of Judah, which is where Isaiah was sent to speak. And there was a northern kingdom at the time called Israel. So they had split off after the time of King Solomon. And so they were sometimes friends, and sometimes enemies. And at this time in history, they were enemies. And so what had happened is Israel and Aram had decided to go to war with Judah. And you can kind of see the red lines here. Their armies had marched down, and this is Jerusalem right here, just on the northern border of Judah. But they'd also marched down along the eastern side and actually attacked so that they could get to the Red Sea down here. And so it was a brutal war. The countryside had been laid waste. That was sort of a typical way that armies would attack in that time, is they would they'd leave the capital for last, the most populous place for last. They'd go through all the country and try and conquer as much of the territory as they can. And armies in those days wouldn't bring food with them oftentimes. They'd go through the country because they were storing up food for the rest of their campaign, for the rest of the war. And so they would march all through Judah and take any standing grain, any cows, any food that they could get their hands on, and they'd capture all of that, and then they'd go up to Jerusalem and start what's called a siege. And so that's sort of what sets the scene for us, is this picture of war, that the countryside has been razed, whatever food that they couldn't take with them, they would just burn. And so it was really a bad time to be alive in Judah. And so everybody is taking refuge in the capital, and even the king himself will start realizing there's going to be a siege in the city soon. And so he's going around doing the things, making sure that the preparations are there so that if they're trapped inside the city, they have enough food and water and different things to make sure that they're going to survive. And so the king at that time was King Ahaz. And so as we've been going through Isaiah, we've read that name in chapter 1. If you think back to chapter 6, right before 7, the beginning of it, verse 1, says that it's in the year that King Uzziah died that Isaiah received the vision in chapter 6. And so one of the things with Isaiah is it doesn't follow precise chronological order. So from chapter 6 to chapter 7, now we have King Ahaz. And Uzziah would be Ahaz's grandfather. So there's quite a span of years there, maybe only six or 7, depending on how exactly we date it. But it kind of jumps a little bit there. We jump past Jotham, who is Ahaz's father, and we get right to the time of Ahaz. And so, why were they attacking? That's of course, we wonder, why is a war taking place? Well, beyond Aram here and Damascus, to the north would be Assyria. We've talked a bit about Assyria already, and they're sort of the superpower in the Middle East at the time. And so Damascus and Israel are aware that Assyria is getting ready for war. And they're worried, and they know that by themselves they can't fight off Assyria. They have way larger armies. And so Aram, Damascus, and Israel, they decide to work together. And they decide, we really need Judah's help. And so that might seem strange to us that then they would go to war with Judah, but they kind of decided either they're going to make Judah help them, because Judah didn't want to, King Ahaz didn't want to help them, or they're just going to get rid of Judah, and then they can just fight Assyria to the north. They don't have to worry about their southern border. And so it's they're trying to form some kind of coalition there. But it was a difficult time for Judah because they were outclassed, really. Judah, you can see, is a larger kingdom, but really from about here south, the southern half here, this is all desert. And so they're the larger country, but they're poorer. The land isn't as good. They have fewer people than Israel. And with Israel and Damascus combined, they're really outnumbered. And so they're really quite worried. And the other thing they know is that even if they somehow manage to hold off Israel and Damascus, Assyria is coming right after them. And they're going to have to fight off Assyria somehow. And so it's into this time that Isaiah comes and gives us prophecy in chapter 7. Right when things are looking really bleak, really dark. Some of you maybe have seen the sort of cynical, demotivational posters. I think the first one they ever came out with was just I think it was a night sky with the northern lights on it. And the caption just said, despair. Things are always blackest right before they go pitch dark. And that's kind of the moment for Ahaz and the people of Judah at this point. Things are looking really bad. And Isaiah comes with a prophecy and he says, don't worry. Don't be anxious. And so let's dive in this morning and read just the first 9 verses of chapter 7 and see what Isaiah has to say. So when Ahaz, son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, was king of Judah, King Rezin of Aram, and that would be Aram in the north, the capital would be Damascus, and Pekah, son of Remaliah, king of Israel, marched up to fight against Jerusalem, but they could not overpower it. And so in those days, if you couldn't overpower a country, the next best thing you could do is lock up everybody in the capital. And so really what we're being told is there's a siege going on in Jerusalem. Verse 2, now the house of David was told, Aram has allied itself with Ephraim. So the hearts of Ahaz and his people were shaken, as the trees of the forest are shaken by the wind. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, go out, you and your son Shear-Jashub. And Shear-Jashub has an interesting name. It literally means a remnant will return. Isaiah has 2 children that we know of, and they get mentioned actually in the chapters 7, 8, and 9. And their names are important, just like the name Emmanuel would be important. And so the name a remnant will return is kind of a pronouncement of something bad's going to happen. Like a lot of people are going to die or be exiled, but it's also a name of hope to say there will be somebody's going to come back. That not all is lost. So anyway, he takes his son and he is told, go meet Ahaz at the end of the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to the launderer's field. And so he's going out to meet King Ahaz, basically where the water is going to be coming into the city. Ahaz is out there to make sure that it's secure because he knows he's about to be invaded. Isaiah is told in verse 4, say to him, be careful, keep calm, don't be afraid. Do not lose heart because of these 2 smoldering stubs of firewood, because of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram and the son of Remaliah. Aram, Ephraim, and Remaliah's son have plotted your ruin, saying, let us invade Judah. Let us tear it apart and divide it among ourselves, and make the son of Tabeel king over it. Yet this is what the sovereign Lord says. It will not take place. It will not happen. For the head of Aram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is only Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be too shattered to be a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is only Remaliah's son. If you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. So Isaiah's commanded is don't be afraid. He says, these two powers that have come against you, Aram and Samaria, in 65 years they're not even going to exist as a people, let alone a nation state to be worried about. But his final word at the end there in verse 9 is that he says, but you need to have faith. You need to trust in God. And that's often, especially as the kingdom of Judah comes into this final century of its existence, that's usually the challenge of the king. Is he going to trust in God, or is he going to trust in political alliances? Is he going to trust in God, or is he going to trust in his own cleverness, his own way of manipulating the situation to see if he can get his way through? And so Isaiah's question for Ahaz is really, where do you find your hope? Is it in what you can bring about? Or maybe in what your neighbor can give you? Or is it in God? And I think that's a good question for us to consider, not just as a political thought of history, but a question for us right here and right now. Where's my hope this Christmas? Am I just kind of holding my breath, waiting for a vaccine? Or hoping that placing my hope in good governance, in our province? And not to say that those things might not be a source of hope for us, but it's really temporary alleviation, isn't it? Something I kind of learned, I think toward my late 20s, during some stressful times at church was, to me, the human heart is kind of like our house in a way. I have a friend actually that's just in the process of moving right now, and he had a house fire about 3 or 4 years ago. He just sent me a message yesterday. He says, "How can somebody who lost most of their possessions in a house fire have so much stuff suddenly?" And it's kind of that rule, right? Like our possessions expand to fill whatever space we happen to have for them. And I think anxiety is kind of that way too. Seems to me we usually have a certain amount of anxiety that we can place about whatever event we deem, most worthy of our worry at the time. And our anxiety will just sort of fill that space, regardless of how significant the issue may be or how insignificant. If we have nothing to worry about, then we will find something to be anxious about. And so I guess my question is, yes, I think we're rightly anxious about COVID-19 and how it's going to play out, in terms of our economy and who's going to get sick and how long this is going to go on. But my question is, why not start trusting God right now? Why not place our faith in Him? Because the reality is that, there could be a vaccine, very soon. It could be in a few months. And I think the reality is in a couple of years, it may just be something that we look back on, and we'll have found something else to worry about in the meantime. And so I think Isaiah's point to Ahaz is, you've got this foreign army coming and invading, from your neighbors to the north. Start trusting God now. Because even in a couple of years, even when they are long gone, you're still going to need to trust God. And I think that's a good reminder for us at this season. And I think that's Isaiah's point too, is not just the burden of trust, here's something to do, but he's also offering some hope too. He says, why not experience hope right now? Rather than going through your days in drudgery, why not experience hope right now? And I think that's our reminder at Advent too, is why not experience hope right now? We don't have to wait, in a sense, even till the 25th. We can have hope right now. But it would be easier, I think, with a sign. Certainly, it seemed that way for Ahaz. And Isaiah kind of understood that there was something going on there, that Ahaz would need a little bit of encouragement. But before I get to that, I do want to point out, even in the last few verses we read, it says, within 65 years, Ephraim will be too shattered to a people. That was a prophecy that came true. Within 65 years, we figure the We figure this prophecy would have been spoken in 735 BC. And by 722, Israel had been invaded by Assyria. And they began a process. Assyria was a terrible kingdom to get invaded by because unlike others that would maybe deport you and put you in sort of a ghetto, a community where you could kind of keep to yourself, Assyria's whole point was we want to defeat our enemies. Like, we don't want them coming back. And so they would spread them to the four corners of their empire and really try to dilute whatever was there. And so then they would invite other people to come move into Israel. And we read about the Samaritans later in the New Testament. That's where they got their beginning, is people moved into Israel that were not Israelites. And so, yeah, within 65 years, really, the nation of Israel ceased to exist. There was a whole new race of people that were living there called the Samaritans. But anyway, there's this thing about the sign. So let's get us into verse 10 to 17. So after this first prophecy, God says, again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz. Ask the Lord your God for a sign, whether in the deepest depths or in the highest heights. In other words, ask for anything. But Ahaz said, I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test. And that should be fairly familiar words to us if we're around the New Testament at all, because it's something that Jesus actually says. They're both quoting from the book of Deuteronomy, where the Lord commands the people of Israel not to put him to the test. But as Jesus and as Moses is speaking in Deuteronomy, the idea is, in your unbelief, don't think you can make God kind of dance to your own tune. And there's something very different going on here. Rather, Ahaz is, I think, trying to camouflage his unbelief. He says, I will not ask for a sign. I will not put the Lord to the test. Well, it's not really putting the Lord to the test if he's commanded you to ask for a sign, is it? I think Ahaz is trying to hide behind some sort of external piety and trying to disguise his disbelief internally. But let's carry on. Verse 13 said, Then Isaiah said, Hear now, you house of David. Is it not enough to try the patience of humans? Will you try the patience of my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a son. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. And here's verses 15 to 17 give us a little bit of a timeline as well. It says, He will be eating curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. For before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. The Lord will bring on you and your people, and on the house of your father, a time unlike any since Ephraim broke away from Judah. He will bring the king of Assyria. And so we're all familiar, of course, with those words. The virgin shall conceive and give birth to a son and call him Emmanuel. And that's obviously a prophecy of Jesus, and we're familiar with it in that context, but it was also a prophecy for Ahaz. And as best as we can tell, the prophecy seems to be a sign not just for 700 years for them, but it must be something that Ahaz could recognize in his own time, so that he could hopefully confirm his faith. And so, in Ahaz's time, what we suspect is, it says a virgin will conceive and give birth to a son. So it wouldn't have been his wife, it wouldn't have been Isaiah's wife, because that would have been a strange word to use for them, a virgin. And so we think there's probably within the royal household, maybe a cousin or a nephew or a niece that is just about to get married, and so that is the child, or that conception is the child referred to in the verse. But what's really important is the timeline. He's basically saying, even with a child conceived right now, within 2 or 3 years, when that child will be born and then eventually weaned from its mother, by that time, all your worries about foreign invaders are going to be gone. The king of Assyria is going to be in your northern neighbors' kingdoms already. And so that's what the talk says. He will be eating curds and honey, referring to being weaned. It says, when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. For before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. And so he's saying, when he's, even within a couple of years, this foreign army is going to be gone. And then he says, reject the wrong and choose the right. That's probably referring to what we would call the age of accountability. And in Jewish culture, they had a very fixed idea of, we know of the bar mitzvah, which is basically a celebration for a young man when he becomes accountable for himself for his obedience to the law. And, in modern days, that's fixed, very fixed date of happening on the child's 12th birthday. Back then, probably there would have been a little bit more leeway. It might have happened as late as 14 or 15. But anyway, by that time, certainly a 15-year-old born in 735 BC, by the time he reached that age, the Assyrian army would have invaded Aram and would have depopulated Israel already. And so that was another prophecy that came true. And it was this sign that Isaiah pointed to for Ahaz to say, look, these things are coming and in an incredibly short while. And interestingly, the whole key there is that Ahaz just needs to put his trust in God and obey him, and God's going to deliver the nation of Judah. And we get into chapter 7, 8, and 9 are kind of all of us a piece in that they are really pointing back to the defeat of Midian when they invaded the nation of Israel in the book of Judges. And in chapter 9, you get a very pointed comment about the comparison between those two time periods. But the whole point is that God is great enough, He's wise enough, He's transcendent and powerful enough around not just Judah, not just Israel, but the whole world. He's enough to be trusted. And that's Isaiah's point for Ahaz. Ahaz needs to take a long view of what's going to be critical in his life in eternity, and that's faith in God. Not the short view of how can I get out of this sticky situation right now. And unfortunately, like most of Isaiah's ministry, Ahaz doesn't really listen. If you look in 2 Kings chapter 16, that's sort of the King's biographer gives one chapter to Ahaz, and the whole point is he doesn't put his faith in God. He's worshiping foreign idols, and ultimately he puts his faith for deliverance in the king of Assyria. You see, he was the superpower of the day. He was going to come in and invade Aram and Israel, and so King Ahaz and Judah figured, well, these guys are invading me, so the enemy of my enemy must be my friend. And so he tries to make political alliances with Assyria, but Assyria still invades Judah ultimately anyway. And eventually it will be this lack of faith that becomes the downfall of the kingdom of Judah. You see, Ahaz receives the sign, and he sees all the prophecies come true, but the sign only confirms faith. It doesn't create it. And I think that's on your outline there. And I think we think about that often. It's like, Lord, if you just gave me a sign, then I'd be able to believe. But the reality is, in almost all of Scripture, is that when miracles happen, it doesn't really change people's minds. It just confirms what they already believe. And, I think the human heart is still the same way. We're looking to God. We almost always have an open door in our minds to revelation. Like, Lord, if you speak to me, I'm going to listen. But often the door of our heart is still closed. And we're not always ready to obey and hear. And so I think for Ahaz, really the barometer of his faith was his hope. What was he placing his hope in? And I think that's the same for us today. What are we hoping about? Is our hope in the Lord, or is it somewhere else? And I think for me that's a good barometer of my faith. How much do I trust God? Well, how much hope do I receive from Him? And I appreciate the grace that I'm given in Jesus Christ, that when I'm without faith, He is still faithful. I think of the simple prayer that's given us in the Gospels. Jesus asks one of the men, that He's about to heal, "Do you believe?" And he says, "Lord, I believe. Help me in my unbelief." And that's kind of my prayer as well. I'm recognizing it's like, Lord, I want to believe, and I have that kernel of faith, but there's so much that seems to be beyond me, and Jesus is more than willing to come and meet me in that. And so I hope that we can take that away from this message and just be encouraged that we can hope in God, and that even when life is at its worst, whether it's invading armies, whether it's pestilence and disease in our country, or some other more personal concern, that we can still learn to depend on God and know that He is trustworthy. And so I wanted to just end this morning with a song, actually. So we're not going to sing together, obviously, but just the well-known Christmas carol, "O Come, Emmanuel," and just really focus on that, just to consider the hope that we have in Jesus Christ and how we get to celebrate that at this season.